Well, what I'm speaking on is the Dead Sea Scrolls. That's the official title, but I don't know whether we couldn't fit it in the box, or maybe we didn't put it down there to begin with. But what I really want to speak on, I suppose, is the Dead Sea Scrolls, and Jesus and that sort of type stuff. So I'm really trying to use the Dead Sea Scrolls rather than... Why don't comments come and sit down here rather than pick up chairs? Why don't you just come and sit? That's right. I don't know. Come sit down. Okay, so that's really the title. Now, I was speaking to a comrade last night, and she asked me, what's the CPGB's line on Chris Knight's theory? And I said, well, the CPGB doesn't have a line on Chris Knight's theory. What we do have is an openness to discuss such things, and we want to put on forums. Equally, I said, well, we don't really have a line on saxophonist jazz, or is it good, is it bad? I mean, we don't have a line, certainly, on the Dead Sea Scrolls. So this is not a CPGB line, this is merely a discussion at Communist University. And you could say to yourself, and I think it's quite legitimate, why on earth should communists at a communist university in London in the year 2009, isn't it? Or is it 8? It's 9, isn't it? 9 be discussing the Dead Sea Scrolls, which were written thousands of years ago? And the answer to that, actually, is, well, I suppose one of the answers is in Kortsky's Foundations of Christianity. He says, well, I've always had a bit of a hobby, in terms of studying Christianity, but why publish this, and why should people bother reading it? And he gives a good explanation. And he says that the proletariat, it's a historical class. It needs to understand history. It's not just an economic class that fights from one battle to another battle. It has to aspire to become the ruling class. And if you want to be the ruling class, you've got to understand history. That means putting defeats and temporary victories into context. And the best way to do that, as Kortsky said, is to get a grasp of history, get a grasp of past societies. So it's with that idea that I'm approaching the subject. Okay, well, let's just begin by asking a question, an obvious question. What were the Dead Sea Scrolls? Well, they were discovered by, I think it was an Arab shepherd or something along those lines, 1947, in a cave in a place called, Conrad, right, which is right at the north of the Dead Sea, south and east of Jerusalem. In the following years, more scrolls were discovered. Also, what was discovered is that a document that's known as the Damascus Document came to earth, well, not came to earth, they found that this had parallels with what they discovered, this document in Cairo. It's called the Damascus Document. It's just worthwhile pointing out, when these people use the term Damascus, they almost certainly were not meaning the city up there. It just meant out there, some land of. That's the basic idea. Okay, so what were the Dead Sea Scrolls? Some of them consisted almost complete scrolls. You all know what a scroll is, don't you, in terms of how they come. I mean, basically, if you look at, if you go to a synagogue, which I've never done actually, priest or the rabbi will read the Bible from a scroll. That's roundly, folded up and that sort of type stuff. So all these scrolls came a bit like...
Well, actually from left to right.
Okay, exactly. Sorry.
Not from top to bottom.
No, okay.
Yeah.
No, okay. But like that, right?
Yeah.
And it came in columns. But that's the basic idea. So they're all rounded up like that. That's the idea, right? Some of them were pretty complete. In other words, you could unroll them quite carefully, and they got them more or less complete. Some words, some fragments will be missing. One of them actually was called the Copper Scroll, and you can imagine that's quite well preserved. Others, on the other hand, would reduce just to fragments. And if you take the historians, scientists, readers, call them what you will for the moment, it was a huge labour trying to put things together. And if you read reconstructions of the Dead Sea Scrolls, lots of it have breaks. Lots of it is just, well, here's a word here, there's a word there, there's a word there. They also have a problem how to fit things together. And what they worked out reasonably quickly is that the people writing it were quite limited in number, at least in terms of the scribes. So they could look at the handwriting of various people and say, well, that could go somewhere there. So it was a bit like a giant jigsaw, and you can imagine with something like 8,000 different bits, it was a huge task to put together. But what was frustrating for a lot of people involved in this project is how slow it was, and it certainly started to take on the feeling amongst many that the slowness wasn't to do with the technical task at hand, it was something to do with those who had possession of it. What we have, as I say, is a whole series of these writings, and these writings, when they were first discovered, of course, caused huge excitement, not only in the field of archaeology, but amongst the general public, because obviously various, how should I put it, interested parties were looking at these things in the short expectation, or should we say hope, that it would confirm their version of history. Or maybe they were looking at them and saying, well, I'll use the word, God help us, maybe they will not confirm our version of history. Take it whatever way you will. 1947, of course, is a very significant date. 1947, those discoveries meant that the material they discovered in 47 goes to Jerusalem, or at least goes to Jordan, right? Jordan. The other discoveries, post-48, here, we all know where they ended up. They ended up in the hands of Israel. Israel actually didn't seem to take them particularly seriously. It was the Christian church, and as I understand it, most of the people in charge of the original translation were Dominicans, right? Now, my story is this, and I'm not going to spend much time on it, is that various people associated with this project began to get suspicious. One of them you might have heard of, John Allegro. Anyone heard of him? He wrote a notorious book. I think it must have been in the 60s. I can remember buying it. But another one of the people who was involved at the time was a guy called Robert Eiserman, right? He's an American Jewish guy, historian, and what he did is go around trying to find access. He was actually officially on the project. He wasn't given the access to these scrolls, and basically what he did, cut the long story short, is that people who'd sent him photographs of these scrolls, he put them together with the idea of publishing them. So these scrolls became public in terms of what was available something like 35 years after they were first discovered. Now, just let me try to give a brief summary of what sort of ideas we find contained in these scrolls. I should also say, by the way, well, we should try and date it. We should try to hazard a guess at not only who was writing the scrolls, which I'll come to in a minute, but crucially when. There's been a huge controversy over the when, and perhaps you'll appreciate why in a little while. Basically, some put it back in terms of the writing of these things to something like 200 BC. Okay, that's way back in Jewish, Israeli, Judean, call it whatever you will, history. Others, on the other hand, bring it considerably more towards the time of the Romans and considerably more towards the time of Jesus, and even up to, and maybe some even beyond, the Jewish Revolution of AD 66 to 70, or you could say 74 if you wanted. Some actually speculate that these documents were deposited in these caves after that. But you see where I'm getting at. Right, okay, well, we'll just leave it there for the moment. In other words, there is a wide variety of different dating. Okay, what is in them? Well, what we find, first of all, is various books of the present Bible transcribed. What we also find is various bits of the Bible we now have transcribed in a different way. So there are different versions of the particular books that we would now call the Old Testament. Right? So you'll find slight changes in certain parts. Let me just give you an example. I was just looking at the other night. I won't go into who and whatever, but one of the patriarchs is in Egypt. He's told to go away by the Pharaoh. His wife, Sarah, is at the mercy of the Pharaoh or his friends and associates. Right? This was a big concern for those that wrote it. So what we have in terms of this story in the Dead Sea Scrolls is that God cursed the Pharaoh, made him impotent, and all his courtiers. So in other words, Sarah, she couldn't have been touched, could she? They couldn't have done anything. Now that is in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It's not in the Bible you've got at home. It's not in my Bible I've got at home. So you've got various copies, as I say, and you've got various versions. Now we should not think that the version we've got is the version. Remember, the version we've got has been chosen out of many other versions, and at the time we need to understand that who knows how many other versions were circulating, right? If you take, for example, in terms of a different religion, when they came to compose the Quran, they apparently discarded all other versions. And I know then, even then, you have ended up with something like 12 official versions of the Quran. But the point I'm really trying to get over is that if you take our so-called Bible, this gives you proof that it's one of at least two. The obvious answer is one of many. The idea that this is therefore the Word of God is quite clearly the word of human beings. Okay, so that's the first thing we find. What we also find is the copper scroll. This is quite fascinating. What we have in that, I'll see if I can look at my notes and find where. I can't find it, but anyway, what it consists of is a whole list of where treasure is buried. Here you will find 30 pieces of gold. There you will find, I don't know, some gold candlesticks. There you will find some precious jewels. Now some people interpreted it as, well, this is just a fantasy. Others said, well, no, we think this is actually real. And again, we'll come to that one. What we also find is writings on the calendar. Now, if we had Chris Knight here, I think he'd be interested in this one. If you take the Jewish calendar, as I understand it, it's a lunar calendar.
With solar correct.
I know, but it's a lunar. It's fundamentally a lunar.
Like Chinese.
Yep, it's a lunar calendar. Now, some Jews calculate the moon when it comes on from when it's like that. Some count the beginning when it's not there, sort of type idea. These people in the Dead Sea Scrolls had a solar calendar. And apparently, again, I haven't actually looked at it. I don't read Hebrew, by the way. But apparently, if you look at the original scrolls, they're trying to work it out. And there's sort of margin and stuff on the margins of where they're going, oh Christ, this is complex, and crossings out, and they're making mistakes, right? But they're very determined that we've got to follow a solar calendar. Now that might strike us as, well, what's the significance of that? Actually, I don't know. But I suspect, well, okay, make sure you'll come in, but I suspect there is a great deal of significance, right? But that's an important thing. So you get a lot of stuff about calendars and when you should celebrate various festivals. Also what we get is various songs, various curses, various stories, but also what we get is what is called, I don't know whether correctly, but this is what in the literature it's called sectarian manifestos, sectarian documents, sectarian declarations. Okay. So, for example, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, what you'll find in fragments and bits here, bits there, is a story of someone called the righteous teacher. You'll also find someone else called the evil spouter. Now, who are these people? You can start to see that there's been a lot of speculation. Who is the righteous teacher? If you're a Christian, you say, well, is it our man? If it isn't our man, were there other people going around at the time that also claimed to be doing what Jesus is sort of doing in the Bible? Leave it there. Who's the wicked priest? Could be this high priest, could be that high priest. And there's been lots of speculation and battles, we could say, about exactly who these characters were. Okay, but before dealing with that, who wrote it? Well, the first idea of the people that got hold of these things was that, well, it could have been the Essenes. Who were the Essenes? Well, what we think we know about Jewish politics at the time mainly comes from a guy called Josephus. Who was Josephus? He was an aristocratic Jew, and he wrote two very famous books that you can pick up, I think for 50p from, is it Wadsworth or whatever they call it? I do recommend it. One is called The Jewish War, and one is called Jewish Antiquities. If you read Jewish Antiquities, which is a real bloody blockbuster of a book, my own take on it is don't bother with about 9/10 of it. Go to the last bit of it. That is fascinating. That is an absolutely fascinating last section of the book. The Jewish War describes the revolution, and it was a revolution, of 66 to 70. In AD 70, the Romans finally break into Jerusalem and sack it, right? The last stand of the resistance fighters is at this famous fortress called Masada, right? If you see it, it's just an awe-inspiring piece of geology. It sort of just towers up, and the Romans took literally years to break in. As they were about to break in, the resistance fighters, all of them commit suicide.
That's
right?
the myth.
Okay, well, okay, well, that's the myth. This is from Josephus.
This is what he said.
Okay, well, let me come to it. I know you're going to be interrupted all the way through, aren't you? Okay, no problem. Okay, what we have in Josephus is a description of what he calls the three parties. Okay, he describes one party. That's the Sadducees, right? These are the high priests and their supporters. These are the high priests of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, and we won't go into the history of it, is the religious political centre of this area. And an area, remember, that has got people who are loyal to this religion, not just in this immediate area, but scattered far and wide. Back into the Far East, places like Babylon, down to here in places like Alexandria, and still, there are sizable Jewish populations even in Rome and places like that. Anyway, these are the guys, the Sadducees. They are very rich because the temple, right, extracts religious tribute from all Jews. These people are mega rich. And according to various stories, they exploit the lower priests even, let alone the people. These people are attached to the, or at least not attached. These people are responsible for the religious ceremonies and, how should I put it, are most certainly not radical, as long as it wasn't from a pig. Or, I'm just making it up. Right? Their religion was not frozen. They could interpret the law. Now that obviously led to disputes, and it obviously led to tension. This guy, Robert Eisenman, on the other hand, paints the Pharisees as the bad guys. These are not a popular party. These are the spouters of lies. Right? These are a party that's undermining our religion. These are people after the smooth way of things. Who else does Josephus talk about? He talks about the Essenes, right? Who are the Essenes? Apparently they're the people, according to the first lot of experts who read it. These are the guys that wrote the thing. Okay, so we all go to our Josephus books and we read up. Who are the Essenes? Well, they seem to have led a very austere life. They would wear the same white garment until it fell to pieces. They seem to have lived in communities. Some of them, there's speculation about did they ban sex or whatever, but who knows. But they had to give away all their money to the leader of the community. These people, according to Josephus, were strict communists. Right? That's his words, well, the translator's words, not mine. Okay? They had most peculiar practices, according to Josephus, and he should know, because he spent a year with them as an initiate. Believe it if you want, but why dispute it? Apparently they had really weird, ceremonies and habits, he says. And he's writing this, it should be emphasised, for the titillation of a Roman audience. This is who the book's aimed at. It's not aimed at particularly Jews, but he is a loyal Jew. It should be emphasised. He's proud of his heritage. Anyway, he reports to the Romans, do you know, after they go to the toilet, we're talking about city downies, right, after they go to the toilet, do you know, they wash their hands. Ha 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 ha. Aren't they funny? No, it's funny, isn't it? I don't know why they do it. But what you find, yes, it's certainly true. If you look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, these people are obsessed with purity, and we shouldn't understand purity in our sense precisely. Every time you go to the toilet, wash your hands. I visited a comrade recently in hospital. I don't know if anyone been to hospital recently. Every wall's got a cleanie handy, you've got to do this. These people were not obsessed by clean hands in that way. What these people are obsessed by in the Dead Sea Scrolls is religious purity, and that's what Josephus is trying to get over. Okay. Then Josephus goes on, which from our point of view is bloody interesting. He says, oh, by the way, there's a fourth party, a fourth philosophy. Ooh, who are these people? These people are the Zealots. These people are the Sicarii. These people are the revolutionaries. These people, they get together with bandits and they go around robbing and insulting their betters. right? These people are outrageous, and he lists loads of them. He hasn't got time to go into detail, but he says, well, there was one guy that led the masses around Jerusalem, and the Romans had to send out a load of troops and kill them. And then someone else takes a load of people to Egypt, and then someone gets together with some robber up here, and oh, there's loads of them. These people are stunned. But he says, right, they're very brave. This man cannot make up his mind about these people, whether he hates them or admires them. Actually, he does both. It's like the bourgeoisie maybe looking at a figure like Che Guevara, or Lenin maybe, or, you know, someone of that stature. They want to loathe him, and at the same time they cannot but help, as a human maybe, just saying, well, these people did sacrifice everything for the cause that they believe. Okay, I just want to deal a little bit more of who Josephus was. He wasn't only a high-class, aristocratic, snobbish Jew that had spent a year with the Essenes and wrote two very interesting, fascinating books. He was also someone, when the revolution began, who the masses or the authorities, call it whatever you will, the first revolutionary government in Jerusalem, put in charge of the defence of Galilee against the Romans. The Jews had driven the Romans out. They defeated them at a famous battle as they retreated from Jerusalem. Bet Horon. Right, it's a famous pass, and it's famous in Jewish history because this is also where the Maccabees beat the Syrian Greeks. And you can only beat such an army if God is on your side. That would be the idea at the time. And to repeat it is truly a miracle. Anyway, he's sent to Galilee. He's in charge of resistance, along with a zealot. Right? The Romans come in, being a sensible chap that Josephus was. He goes and joins the Romans. Right? He describes, we don't have to take everything he says as literal. He describes himself outside the walls of Jerusalem, telling people, look lads, look lasses, you better surrender, you cannot beat the Romans, they're invincible, see sense. Some people inside Jerusalem say he's talking sense, and the zealots, I'm being very crude here of course, kill them. Right? But basically the masses shout out, you know, that's the attitude that they have to Josephus. Okay, so this is the first theory, that it was the zealots, not the zealots, it was the Essenes that wrote it. Since then, there's been a lot of dispute, and most authorities no longer accept that as an idea. But I think what we should emphasise here is that Josephus, while he's an invaluable source, shouldn't be thought of as a modern journalist, shouldn't be thought of as someone who's going out there with his notebook and accurately, or even being able to accurately report it. It's as if I got hold of General Dannett, you know, head of the British Army, and I said, well, there you are, as you are now, give me a report of the revolutionary left in Britain. Right? I mean, that's basically what you're asking a man to do. And he might have heard of the Socialist Workers' Party, he might have heard of the Communist Party of Great Britain, in terms of a name, right? He might have heard of Trotskyism, he might have heard of Maoism, but if you sat him down, he could well describe, he wouldn't be able to understand the difference between the CPB, the CPGB as it is now, the history of its past, what relationship that has to the Socialist Workers' Party. He would be quite capable, for example, of describing what used to be the ISG, the International Socialist Group of Alan Thorpe. He'd be quite capable of describing it as Stalinist. Right? He would, you know. He'd be quite capable of describing all sorts of things as a Maoist, or these people admire Che Guevara. He could produce you a very confused, but also very, how should I put it, shallow description. So in that sense, while we should view Josephus as a hugely valuable source, we need to understand who wrote it, and we need to understand that at the time these names were more like party titles, right? And if you think about the left, or for that matter the right, party titles are disputed between various parties. Who nowadays, for example, isn't a Democrat? well, I know you might better find somebody in British politics that isn't a Democrat, but name me one. I mean, BNP, the Tories, the Liberals, English National Party, SNP, you know, I cannot actually, I think, well, it's not surprising, is it? So in that sense, if we thought of these words, Sadducee or Essene, we shouldn't just think about them as disembodied. This is the title of. We should think about them in terms of we're on the right side, we are the holy, we are the true to God. And nobody's going to let your opponent simply have that party title, aren't you? It's like us with the CPB. We're not going to allow them to have the word communist. These people are false communists. We all know that, don't we? Yes. They are false communists. Okay. Socialists. Is the CPB really socialist? No. No. Right? Are the Tories really Democrats? No. Right? So you get the idea. So what I would suggest, give me a shout. Oh, that's all right, no problem. So what I would suggest is that when we approach the Dead Sea Scrolls, we should not be approaching it from the point of view that here are four parties, you know, Essenes, Sadducees, Pharisees, and the Zealot fourth party. What we should approach it as is that in reality, Jewish politics, just like present-day politics, contain a whole myriad of competing factions, competing parties, competing individuals, right? We're getting to Monty Python territory now. Everyone's seen Monty Python. Wonderful, wonderful film. I'm talking about The Life of Brian, of course. Wonderful film. I remember when I first went to see it, I was going out with a Christian girl. I thought it was a hoot. But it was a hoot against me as well, wasn't it? Right? It was lovely, because you saw the left in a mirror. How ridiculous we are in that sense. And as seen through the eyes of people, yes, in that sense, share our humour about the left. Okay, so what happens is Brian goes up in the rocket, remember that, with the bug-eyed monster, and they have a battle in space, and crashes down. He comes out, and don't the Romans chase him or something like that? I can't remember. But anyway, he comes down, and what is in the market square in Jerusalem? Well, you know, I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but it's along the lines of, verily, I have a cup, and you should follow the cup, etc., etc., etc. Now, if you read Josephus, right, although he talks about four parties, I've already said that actually he talks also, right, elsewhere in his description of what is going on, about this country being seething with discontent and seething with different parties, different factions. This country is in revolution, and this society is being torn apart by revolution. The masses from below have been mobilized. In Jerusalem, when the Romans are besieging it, we have a second revolution. The Zealots, or various factions, they're fighting each other as well. They cannot even get their own act together. They fall out with each other. Some of them go south to Masada, right? Anyway, the basic point is that if you want, I think it's a good history actually of this period. The best one I've read is by Neil Faulkner, who's an SWP comic, who wrote Apocalypse, I think it was called. Anyway, it's an excellent description, and I can tell you what he bases himself on in terms of his, how should I put it, architecture of his book. It must be Trotsky's writings on the Spanish Revolution. Anyway, leave that one aside. It's a very compelling book in terms of his description of the intensity of the revolution, and how the revolution goes in from a moderate stage where people like Josephus are in charge, to an extremist democratic stage where the Zealots are in charge. The Zealots call no man Lord except for obviously the Lord. These people, some of them are Republicans, others of them are looking to a Messiah. Various factions declare their guy the Messiah, others obviously don't accept their guy as the Messiah. But the general point I'm trying to make is this land was seething with parties, seething with ideas. And what we need to understand is when we approach the idea of religion, of course, we've got secular brains now, right? we cannot easily get into the heads of these people. What we need to understand about this time, just like all history really, I suppose before the French Revolution, is that religion and politics are fused. They're not separate categories, right? They are one. So in that sense, if you're going to express a political program, you have to. You cannot do anything else in this world other than express it in biblical, religious terms. That's your justification, that's your understanding of the world you live in. This is how you are going to fight for your interests. It's impossible to do anything else for these people. In other words, when we read the Dead Sea Scrolls, we should try to read it with their eyes or their brains, and not by, how should I put it, looking down on these people as if they're just talking rubbish. We could, yes, put our hoods over our heads, put on a funny voice, and I could read you sections of it, which I might do if I get the time, in terms of the purity laws. I was saying to comrades last night, in terms of this community in the camps, if someone fell asleep while the righteous leader was addressing the congregation, you are deprived of all rations for 10 days, and we'll expel you from the community, sort of type idea. So just watch it. Just watch it. And if people laugh loudly when the righteous teacher or one of the priests is talking, again, you are out. These people were pretty prim and proper, right? Okay. Now, where to go next? Okay. What we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is not only these arguments between this faction, whoever they were, and other factions. What we have is not only their purity laws, their various versions of the Bible that are slightly different, their versions of the Bible that are the same as we've got. What you also have, which is, I think, extremely important, is the idea of the last days, right? God's kingdom is just about to arrive. We are living in the last times, and we're not talking about a general crisis of capitalism. We are talking about the arrival of God's kingdom on earth. What is God's kingdom all about? Well, it's about a Messiah, a deliverer, who will arise amongst the people of Israel. There's various arguments of, which individual, or is it one individual, is it two individuals, is it one first and then another? But certainly it's premised on the idea of a Messiah. Where does this Messiah come from? Not out of thin air, doesn't come down from heaven. This is someone born of the branch of David. You remember David Koresh and the branch Davidians? The idea is these people come out of the royal house of Israel. They come from the house of David, right? We'll think about that one in a little while. Okay. This doesn't just say there will be a miracle. God comes down, looks at humanity and says, right, I'm now going to judge you being good, you being bad, you go to hell, I don't know what happens, you have life forever. That's not how it's going to be, brethren, right? What it's going to be is a final battle. You've all heard of the term Armageddon. It's going to be a final battle between good and evil, the forces of light and the forces of darkness. The forces of light have got to fight. Right? They have got to be pure. They have got to be ready for the last time. That's why they're preparing in these camps. These people believe it. That's why there's no laughter. That's why there's no dirtiness. There's no smuttiness. Right? You are pure. You are ready as a warrior. Right? These people, in terms of these scrolls, organise themselves according to these documents. You don't need to take it literally, but they organise themselves into tens, 50s, hundreds, thousands, right? This is a military camp, right? In terms of the camp, no dogs are allowed, no blind people are allowed, no deaf people. What was that? Deaf people are not allowed because you are not hearing the word of God. Right? That's the point. It's not because you're deaf, you cannot hear the word of God. When I'm reading the word of God, you cannot hear, you are out. If it comes to the word of God, if you cannot see, you are out. So we need to understand these people. These people are fanatical warriors preparing to liberate their people and establish what we would describe as a theocracy. Right? This is not just about Judea. This is not just about Israel. This is global. God's kingdom will come. The Messiah will rule. Those that have sinned will be cast to hell. The just, the meek, the pure will inherit the world. Jerusalem will be rebuilt. There are plans in here to rebuild Jerusalem on a stupendous scale. The temple becomes as big as the city was itself at this time. They detail the plans. It will be X cubits here. It will have 4 courts. It will have jewels there. The gate will be like this. This is what they are thinking. But as I said, these people have to fight. These people are not going to be given God's kingdom. They have to be pure, but they also have to engage in a battle. And what we have in the Dead Sea Scrolls is a document that's entitled, by modern authors, I hasten to add, the War Scroll. Right, page 152. 5 minutes? 5 minutes, okay. Let me have 152. Okay. Just wanted to give you a flavour. Okay, these people are not only fighting, by the way, the forces of darkness, they're also fighting the people that are called in here the Kittim. The Kittim. Most people now readily accept that the Kittim refers to the Romans. Right, so the Romans are the big, terrible enemy. There's a description here. They come from over the sea. They destroy, they take, they loot. They take everything. These people have horrible power. But they are going to be fought by the forces of light. And on the appointed day, there will be a battle of annihilation by the son of the sons, I should say, of darkness. What we also have later on is a detailed description of 7 battles. We have a detailed description of not only the cavalry divisions of the sons of lightness, we have a description of their helmets, of their shields, their breastplates, and what's going to be written on them. Right? We have detailed description of what the infantry are going to wear. We have detailed description of what those that pick up the bodies of the Kittim will wear. We have a detailed description of the final battle. After 7 days, the Kittim will be defeated and God's kingdom will be declared. Okay, in 5 minutes, what I'm now going to do is just to say what this guy, Robert Eiserman, in this book talks about. Maybe I'll try to do it for 6. I don't know. Okay. What this guy has written a number of books, but I think easily his best book is a book called James, the Brother of Jesus. Right? Wonderful book. His basic thesis is, if you read the Acts, at the end of the New Testament, this describes, according to the writers of the Acts, a split in the Jesus party after Jesus was crucified. There's a split between Paul and James, the brother of Jesus. And Christians have had a huge problem with the idea of the brother of Jesus. If you look at various versions of the Bible and various versions of who this guy is, go and ask a Catholic priest. He will tell you, well, maybe he was a distant cousin. Maybe he was, what do they call it, a breast brother, or, some... What?
Foster brother.
Perhaps. Anyway, the Christians have an obvious problem, don't they, comrades? Right? Because we all know Jesus was born of a virgin via God. We also have, though, in the Bible, two versions of Jesus coming from who? David, right? We have a description, he's 25 generations removed from David, and David is 25 generations removed from Adam. Jesus, according to that version of it, is bloody well, it's obvious what he's proclaiming to be. He's claiming to be the Messiah of the branch of David. He's proclaiming himself to be the legitimate king, right, of Jerusalem, of Israel. He's proclaiming himself to be the universal Messiah that will be ruled over by the Jewish elite. That's what he's claiming. The Christians, therefore, have an obvious problem with James. Right? Who is this James, brother of Jesus? Well, we know, according to the Bible, that I have at home, and some other comrades will have at home, that there's a split between him and his brother, who takes over the church. He is the head of the party now. So, Eisenman, I think, does a brilliant job of bringing to life James. What is amazing, actually, about James is that we have reference to James in Josephus. We do not have reference to Jesus in Josephus. Isn't that remarkable? Right? The Christians, and this is also an interesting story, obviously recognise that as a slight problem, and we don't know when, but some copyist or some committee, right, in terms of later editions of Josephus, corrected that little mistake, and has in Josephus, of course, everyone recognised Jesus, this holy man. Some called him Son of God, etc. Even if you go back to the French Enlightenment, someone like Rousseau, who didn't have our modern techniques, said this is an obvious forgery. It's bullshit, and it is bullshit. But of course, what we need to understand as Marxists is when someone does that, that's significant. So we don't dismiss it as bullshit and therefore discard it. We recognise its significance, and that is that the Christians recognise a problem with their story. Anyway, in this book, what Eisenman does, he actually boasts at the front, by the way, that his son designed a cover. This is the Turin Shroud. I think it's a pretty bad choice myself, right? And he also boasts that his wife did all the proofreading. God, I don't know if that's meant to be a criticism of the proofreading in here. It's embarrassing. Leave that one aside. It's dreadful, right? Leave that one aside. What he does in this book is says, I have finally proven that if you take the righteous teacher in the Dead Sea Scrolls that's in this book, I can prove logically, beyond a shadow of reasonable doubt, that the righteous teacher is James, exactly, not Jesus. Jesus actually now becomes in Eisenman a shadowy figure that's got to do with some person who dies on the Sea of Galilee defeated by the Romans when they're coming in. I think it's a ridiculous story myself, but the point I'm trying to make is, yes, he goes through the Dead Sea Scrolls and he goes through other historical documents, he investigates it, he cross-examines it, he looks at it from this angle, he looks at the various things, and he can put forward a convincing case for it. Right? Now, what I would suggest, and I'm going to finish here, he might be right. I mean, I'm not an expert, I'm not going to say. But the point I'm really trying to get over is that what we have in terms of our history of this period shouldn't be thought of as a complete picture. It's a bit like if you take, I suppose, Chris Knight's theory of the origins of humanity. Here's this ochre. Here's the present-day ceremonies. I'm not saying then you add one and one together, but here's our theoretical framework. I'm going to construct a theory, right? What we need to do is look at various theories, and at the present time we need to say what one's most convincing. That doesn't mean we're actually convinced by it, but if it's got legs, it's worthwhile taking seriously. Okay. Lastly, therefore, if we take the Dead Sea Scrolls, what it casts light on is not only ancient history, where we could construct, I think, some sort of scenario about who wrote it, what significance this has in relationship to the Bible, the crucial thing that comes over to me about all of this sort of stuff is that religion is a thoroughly human thing, right? It is thoroughly man-made or woman-made, human-made, right? And in terms of religion, if we investigate religion, not as something that's obviously hocus pocus, but is so obviously human, what we do is discover something about ourselves and the society that we live in. That's why we should take religion seriously. Thank you.